Hello, Diana Initiative. Welcome to our noon talk on the stage 3. I'm Jeff Briner coming to you from Portland, Oregon. Just a couple quick reminders and we'll get right into the talk. So very quickly, thanks again to our sponsors. Without these sponsors, this doesn't happen. So be sure to stop by the expo hall and say hi to them. Maybe your only chance to meet face to face with some of these folks during a pandemic, of course. And a quick program note, so we're delaying the closing keynote by a half hour today, just in order to give all the tracks and sessions time to finish up so that everyone can attend the closing keynote. So that'll be Gatekeeping, Gaslighting, and Grieving, given by Kirsten Brager. It's at 4:30 Pacific time PM on the main stage, stage 1. And now I'm thrilled to introduce Emily Crose, to take us through a deep dive into spycraft and walk us through how to make a microdot. Emily's been in information security for over 10 years. Previously, she's worked at the CIA, NSA, US Army INSCOM, and in her free time, she runs the Hacking History Project and co-authors The Teletypist. Take it away, Emily. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. So today I'm going to be giving you a talk on how to make microdots. So I've titled this, So I Made a Microdot. So let's get into who I am, just to start with. My name is Emily Crose. I'm a senior industrial pen tester at Dragos Incorporated. We do industrial pen testing. In the evenings, I just wreak havoc on things. My Twitter is there at hexadecimate. And if you are looking for me on LinkedIn, please don't try and find me. Okay, so table of contents, just to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So in the first, this is going to be divided up into 3 parts. There's going to be a part about history, kind of like the what is of a microdot. The second part is going to be microdot production, how we actually create the microdot. And then the third part is modern use. So why are we doing this, and why would it be useful today? Before we get started, I want to address one of the most prolific members of the security community, Fred Durst, who once said, if you want to know how not secure you are, just take a look around. Nothing's secure. Nothing's safe. I don't hate technology. I don't hate hackers, because that's what comes with it. Without those hackers, we wouldn't solve the problems that we need to solve, especially security. I think if we all take a moment to really reflect on that statement, we'll understand the why I decided to do this. So what is the point of using this ages-old, 100-plus-year-old technology? What possible use could it have today? And as we go through the slides that will explain to you the history and the how-to, just keep in mind that there doesn't need to be a reason for everything that you do. This just happened to be something that I have a little bit of personal interest in. And actually it started as something that I wanted to do for the first issue of the Teletypist, and I didn't think that I could do it. So in a way, doing this was kind of my way of proving to myself that I could do anything that I really wanted to, even if it seemed like totally useless or totally off the wall. So thank you, Fred Durst, for restoring my confidence in myself. Okay, so about what exactly is a microdot? Like, maybe you've heard the term and you're not exactly sure what it is. Well, a microdot is this thing I am trying desperately to pick up here. This is a microdot. It's not visible probably on your end, but I assure you that I'm holding a microdot, and I have also lost this microdot 4 times in the past 12 hours trying to experiment with actually picking it up with a set of tweezers. So microdot is essentially takes an entire page worth of information, like this, an entire legal page, and it shrinks it down into a very small space. This technology is not new. It's been around for a very long time. As I said, it's over 100 years old. If we really were to go back and try and find exactly where it started, we would find that a microdot was invented in the late 1800s. So it's not new by any stretch of the imagination. Here's a photo of some microdots that were seized. I believe this is like a Cold War, World War II photo. This is a series of microdots taken without magnification, I believe. And this was, you can actually find this one on the Wikipedia for the National Security Agency. So it's out there and available, but this is essentially what I just held up with the tweezers. It's just a series of them all taped to a piece of paper or probably glued to a piece of paper. The earliest examples that we have of microdots being used in military technology for an actual, like, real practical purpose would be with, if you're familiar with RFC 2549, the QoS over avian carriers, which is a kind of it's a tongue-in-cheek RFC, but this actually was this was the OG way of transferring information from one place to another using carrier pigeon. So what microdots essentially allowed us to do during World War I is to send more information or essentially increase the bandwidth over your avian carrier by shrinking down the packet size, so to speak, and allowing it to attach to a carrier pigeon or homing pigeon much more easily than something that was much larger. The normal way of doing this would be to print it out onto a very small slip of paper. There's a little bit more weight attached to that, but with a pigeon, every ounce counts. I just made that up. So doing microdots is kind of just a more, it's a more natural, low overhead way of transferring information from one place to another. But by the time we get to the Second World War, microdot technology's changed quite a bit, and it turns out the uses have changed quite a bit as well. So on the images that you can see here on the left, there's a picture of I believe this is a German produced microdot camera that's produced specifically for the purpose of creating microdots. On the right side, you see an envelope with actual microdots attached to it. You can probably barely see it, but if you look very closely at the open flap of the envelope in the middle of not the top part, but actually the center fold part of the envelope, there's a very small red circle, and inside that red circle is maybe 3 or 4 microdots attached to the page. So those are actually even smaller than the ones that I produce in this for this presentation. This I believe is in the FBI collection, and I believe this is also an example of German microdot technology. But the reason in World War II and further into the future is for more covert message transfer. So whereas the pigeons were also in a form of covert message transfer, that wasn't really the primary driver for why they were being used. The primary driver was just for short field communications where radios may not be ubiquitous. So there are some very prominent examples post World War II where microdots were used for espionage purposes. The man on the left is James Stockdale. James Stockdale was a downed pilot during the Vietnam War. He was kept in Ho'oleau prison. You probably know it as the Hanoi Hilton. What you may not know about James Stockdale, if you don't know of him as a person, Stockdale was recruited by the CIA to send messages from the prison and report on conditions of prisoners. He was also taking information from the agency at the time as well. Stockdale was more or less recognized as the organizer inside Ho'oleau for his stay there. He was actually in the Hanoi Hilton from 1965 to 1973. So for quite a while, he was the CIA's go-to guy for organizing messages in and out of the prison. So there's an evolution of microdot technology that leads up to from Stockdale to the man that we see on the right side. The man on the right side is named Adolf Tolkachev. You may recognize Tolkachev as the billion-dollar spy, is kind of as he is popularly known. Tolkachev was a Soviet-placed science officer who used a variety of methods to take photos of sensitive documents and got them back to his CIA handlers during the 1970s. I believe he was arrested in the early 80s by Soviet
Hey, Tracy.
Soviet folks.
Hi. Sorry.
Yeah, so we have quite a few examples of microdots being used throughout the Cold War, and kind of coming into their own as a technology for transferring secrets. We also have some non-espionage examples that exist kind of throughout this time period where they're being used. On the far right, you'll notice something that it may be something that looks familiar to you. It's a very small book-like thing with a microdot inside of it that just contains the Lord's Prayer. If you look through the lens there, you'll see a very small an enlargement of a very small copy of the Lord's Prayer on the inside of the book. And people also use this technology for all kinds of different things, like in the middle image where there's just a picture of a loved one. Same sort of effect there. If you look through the lens, you'll see the picture on the inside. But also porn. People liked to have porn on them. I don't understand why you would need such a thing anywhere you go, but I guess phones kind of changed the way that we consume that type of imagery. So on the far left there, you see just a very miniaturized pornographic picture from the early days. Microdot production. So this is where things get kind of fun, and I'm sure why ultimately a lot of folks came to this presentation. So in my experimentation here, I did this with 2 stages. The first stage will produce a microdot that's a little bit larger than the one that I showed earlier. And as I try to take it out of my cap here, you should get a microdot that's about this size. So this is 1.5 centimeters in length. I call this a macro dot. So it's not quite a microdot, but still probably useful for some standard purposes. Maybe where you don't necessarily, this to me is the kind of, this is the method of microdot technology where if you may not be having somebody giving you too much scrutiny, but maybe just enough that they might find something like this. The information shouldn't be terribly sensitive if you're using it, but this is actually a copy of the one that you see on the on the left image. And then the 2-stage, the one on the right image that I showed earlier, that's 3 millimeters in length. So actually much, much smaller. I would say, just kind of reckoning, it's maybe a sixth the size of the macro dot. So you can shrink down the image into very small pieces depending on what your operational needs are. So the 1-stage method. This one is actually is fairly easy to do. But what you do is you start with something worth taking a photo of. So maybe this is one-time pad keys, maybe this is privileged information, or just messages that you want to get to or from somebody that's possibly under surveillance. So to do this, you're going to need a few different types of materials. In my case, this is what I started with. This is just a forged one-time pad. I kind of reverse engineered this one. So I created the one-time pad after I created the message. This is something that I'm using for the teletypist. So I just kind of like did a keyboard walk and created this. But I start with this image, and then I start to gather up the other materials that I need. So I have a 35 millimeter camera. There's nothing special about this. This is just something that I've had since, like, I think I've had this camera since high school. Some high grain black and white film is something else that you're going to need. So in this case, I just bought some 400 TX black and white Kodak. It's cheap. I forget how much I paid for it. And then I also had kind of a stack of materials in the image that you see on the right. So on the right, there's a cutting board, purple cutting board. I also have an X-Acto knife. And underneath both of those things is a black poster board, which won't be used in the first, the 1-stage method, but it will be used in the 2-stage. So just keep in mind that you saw that here, because it's gonna come back in a moment. Okay, so this is declassified from a CIA document. This is kind of just demonstrating how we have to set up our shot. So in this picture, there's a Minox camera. This is a camera that's designed specifically for the purpose of creating microdots. These were heavily used in the 1970s, but you can see these all over the place in museums that have like old spy tech. But essentially the idea here is that there's a piece of paper or a document that you want to take a photo of. There's a very handy little stand that your camera can go on to hold it just far enough away from the page that you can take a photo of it, and that it will be in focus when the microdot is created after you take the photo. For my purposes, though, because I was using a 35mm camera, which is more of the Adolf Tolkachev way of doing it, if you're familiar with that case, I just stood in my kitchen and took a photo of the subject document that I needed to take a photo of. What you're trying to do here is to get the piece of paper or the document that you want to photograph to fill the entire viewfinder, focus it, and then snap your photo. That's really all there is to it. What you're going to produce there is a 35mm negative that's a full-size 35mm negative of just the document. So once you do that, then that's essentially the first stage. There are different ways of doing this. So just as kind of an addendum, if you wanted to make a much smaller microdot, so if you wanted to end up with the 1.5 centimeter macro dot that I create here, what you would do essentially is increase the distance between the document and the camera lens. And there are lots of ways that you can do this. In my case, I used a very advanced technological method called standing on my kitchen counter and taking a photo of it, just making sure that I could get the focus right on the document. So this is, you know, easy to do. If you had a situation or environment where you could do this, there's no reason not to do it this way. Given enough focal length, you could do something like stand on a ladder as well and also get a similar result that would actually be much smaller, probably closer to the 1mm or the 1.52mm micro dot, like true micro dot size. But it's all about your setup and what type of camera that you're using. So the limitations to miniaturization just on a one stage microdot are your distance from the target, the focal length that you have or how focused your lens is going to let you get, the film contrast, and then the practicality, like why you would need something that's much smaller versus something that's quite a bit larger. So some of these are problems that you can solve through technology. And others are just, you know, more operational need type of driven decision making. So it's really up to you and your needs. If you do end up in a situation where you need something much smaller, though, film contrast and focal length are going to come much more into play. In fact, all of these things will probably be much more difficult to do if you're in an operational environment where you need to have something that's quite a bit smaller than what I've produced here from the one stage. But once you take your photo and you send it to the developers, what you're going to get back is basically what you see here. So it's a 35mm negative. I have already cut off the bottom reel holders, so that's you're looking at just the bottom part cut off. But that's the only processing that's happened here. What you would do then is then put this into the cutting board, kind of cut it along the edge of the sheet, and you would have a standard 35mm frame with just the information that you needed to miniaturize on it. This is already quite a bit smaller than a legal pad. So if you can imagine what a 35mm negative looks like versus a full-size page of information, it's quite a bit smaller. So that alone may be all that you need operationally in order to get your information from one place to another, or to even just maintain the information that you have in a state that's going to make it semi-secure and easy to store. But again, operational needs here, something that you probably want to take into account. This image is just a comparison between the macro dot that I've created on the left and the standard 35mm size. So As you can see here, it's maybe 1/4 the size the Microdot is of a standard 35 millimeter. I would add that definitely still readable by the human eye, just by the naked eye without having to magnify it at all. So you can hold this thing up to a clear sky and read the entire document if you needed to, for either of the examples here, including the Microdot. So no advanced magnification is needed in order to read the information that you have miniaturized. Again, it's kind of just about where you want to put it, though. So like if you had a specific method in mind to transfer this information, or a specific place that you needed to put it, the smaller Microdot may be the best option for you. But you'll see an example in coming slides of where you might want something that's kind of more in the middle of a true Microdot, 1 millimeter, versus the Macrodot, so to speak, at maybe 1.5 centimeters. But this is what the Microdot looks like when you hold it up to a clear sky day. I usually wear glasses, so it's not eminently readable for me, but probably for many of you, you'll be able to actually see this. This is enlarged just slightly, so it's actually a little bit bigger than the Microdot is in true size in the picture. So there's only a minor amount of magnification happening here, which means that even under more difficult circumstances where you don't have magnification, I mean, you could move it closer to your eye and be able to see it just as easily. So, okay, so who cares? What do we do with a one stage? Well, as I was saying before, if you had an operational need where you needed to transfer information on a Microdot, you could put this kind of thing under a stamp. So here's just kind of an example of how it would fit under a standard US postage stamp. It would definitely fit there. You would just attach it to an envelope and the Microdot would be there. Not many people are going to think to look at it there unless they are doing like counterintelligence work or are familiar with this method. Stamps are kind of a standard place to put Microdots, though. So if you're in a position of needing to transfer that information a little bit more discreetly, a stamp probably wouldn't be the best way to do it. But then there's a two-stage method as well. So if you have two rolls of film and you develop the first one and you decide that you just need something that's a little bit smaller, you would move on to the two-stage. So just to recap where we were with the end of the first stage, we ended up with a 1.5 centimeter negative that can be read with the human eye without any magnification. So you would take that, cut that board, the black board that I told you about before, that I told you was going to come back. You take your X-Acto knife and you cut out a very small section for either your 1.5 centimeter Microdot or 35 millimeter standard negative, which is what I used here actually. I used an insulated foam board because it actually held the negative better. So it fits in the slot and it didn't move around very much in the process of attaching it to the lamp. So you do need to backlight it. And I would just point out that this is a very low cost setup here to produce the Microdot by attaching the blackboard to just a lamp in my workroom. That was enough backlighting to give me an image that came through. So I would stand maybe 3 or 4 feet from the board, focus it as best I could, and take a photo. Now, the wisdom I would say about doing it this way is that it doesn't always work quite the way that you would expect in practice. So the instructions that I got were from an old book on just like, it's one of those children's book on spy technology, like older spy technology. And this is called the British method of Microdot creation. So the British method says that when you go to do this part, that you should make sure that the negative is in focus. In reality, you're not really going to be able to focus this up in a way that's going to be done competently. So you kind of just have to do it as best you can and hope for the best at the end. With more advanced technology, this kind of eliminates the problem of having to focus on something that's already small to begin with. I will go over some ways to improve this process, though, if you were to want to do this for something that's more like use around the house or whatever, if you've got a modern use for this. But this is the best that I could do. I still ended up with a result, though, and here's what it looks like. So when you get the film back after the two-stage method, you get your true microdot, and this is as it appears on the actual negative. So when you get this back, it's really just a matter of doing the same thing that you did with the one stage. You cut very carefully around the edges, and this is where the X-Acto knife comes in really handy. Just very carefully cutting the rectangle out and doing your best not to lose it, which seriously is a big headache with these. One of my consultant contacts on this project, John Mendez, was explaining to me that you may just be in a situation where if you're doing this, back in the old days, they would have these problems where in the lab they would have negatives that were this size, and the microdot would come back, and if somebody just kind of like sneezed in the wrong place or breathed the wrong way, it would just become dust and would disappear into the ether. So keeping track of microdots is actually much more difficult even than you may think. So the preferred method of transferring a microdot from one place to another is to lick the fingertip, dab, and then pick it up just like this. If you end up having to handle them, it's just a practical issue that you're gonna have to try to find a way to work around. But this is ultimately what it looks like when you get it all cut out. So it literally is it's smaller than my fingertip, which is why these things are so difficult to keep track of. So so that's the two-stage method. There are practical differences between the one-stage and two-stage method. Again, most of this is just going to be operations need driven. Maybe your need is just to retain some information so that it doesn't get lost, and you don't want anybody to find it. That this is going to be a really probably a more difficult option than the Microdot is for just keeping track of it. But I mean, I've even talked to people who maybe are ex-military, and if you know anybody, or if you've been in the military yourself. I haven't been in the military myself, but I do know people who, I've known a lot of folks who've gotten out of the military, and your DD-214 is just something you can't ever lose that. You can, and you can get one back, but if you lose that document, it's going to cause some trouble for you. So I've known people print out 1 trillion copies of their DD-214 just to have them around. So maybe this is one thing that you want to do, is take a picture of your DD-214 just so you have 1 million dust-sized copies of it laying around. But the obvious problem once you get something the size is, okay, well, how am I gonna read this? This is not readable with the naked eye. You can kind of see when something is etched to the photo, or to the negative, but it's not readable. Even just if you hold it super close to your eye, is no way that you're going to be able to actually determine the difference between letters. So the way that professionals view microdots is with the Stanhope lens. The one in the upper left, the metallic one, is like one that you could wear around your neck, possibly. That's an antique Stanhope lens where you would just put the microdot on the flat end, and then you could read it through the curved end. The more modern version of the antique Stanhope lens is one of those little, and most people have seen this, I think, like a little gift box with maybe a picture or grain of rice or something that's had a picture put on it, or a message written on it. You can just put it in a little plastic box like this and read the microdot. But they've also done put Stanhope lenses into things like the ring that you see on the right side, again, with porn in it. So there are lots of different ways that you can maintain a microdot and read it later on. All of these are options that are still fairly readily available, so they're not too hard to get. And then this is what it looks like under magnification. So if you wanted to look at the microdot, what you would see is more the image on the left side. Now, I will freely admit that my microdot did not come out great. It's not readable. It's not. You can see the difference in the microdot and the macrodot in terms of readability. And again, I will explain how we can improve this operationally in the future. And then on the right side, there's this is actually a smaller version of the macrodot that I was able to produce with the one-stage method. So we did get one that was quite a bit smaller, but not readable with the human eye or with the naked eye, and but very readable under magnification. So in this case, I put the microdot and the macrodot into my son's antique microscope and looked at them that way. So okay, so modern use. There's maybe a misconception that old technologies become obsolete and there's no reason to revisit them. If that's kind of the camp that you're in, then here's a meme for you. Microdots are absolutely not played out technology. They're just in search of a new application, is my nice way of putting this. So if you need to there's all kinds of different ways that you can use these things. Some notes on operational security, though, before we get into the more modern use cases. Problems that we encountered during this process of bandwidth, obviously, the amount of information transferable is relatively small. It's fairly labor intensive. The development is something that you end up having to deal with because there's not a whole lot of folks that are actually developing film in person anymore in a way that you can get the negatives from. And it's also very low tech. So if you wanted to process something and take it from an analog state to a digital state, it's going to be definitely non-trivial to do that. Which maybe there's benefits to doing it that way. Again, all up to your needs and how you apply the technology. A note on the film development, though. So what I did was I ended up mailing out the negatives to a film processor that did this relatively cheaply. I think each development job on the 2 rolls of film that I submitted to them were $13 a piece. So it's not terribly expensive for this kind of one-off use case. It was affordable for me just to have fun with. If you had to do this at scale, though, I wouldn't recommend using a microdot, like a standard microdot for this, a standard analog microdot for this. But so modern use cases, maybe you have something like a Bitcoin key and you don't want to buy one of these big, ridiculous chunks of metal to inscribe your key onto. This one was submitted to Reddit about 2 weeks ago, and I found it. Somebody had sent me this on Twitter and kind of pointed out this thing that somebody had found in a wall, and they weren't sure what it was. It turns out it's probably a Bitcoin key. So what you would do with this is you could apply a microdot technology to make a miniaturized version of your Bitcoin key, so that you can store all your fake money securely that way. You could also save something like a one-time pad or a very sensitive set of keys that you don't want anyone to get a hold of. You could save that to a microdot and put it inside of something else. So in this case, there's all these stories of the KGB used to create one-time pads and then put them into concealment so that their assets overseas could use them. There's a particularly prominent one of the authorities going to investigate the house of a spy somewhere in West Berlin is like the closest I could find information on this. And the subject's house is completely empty of all food except for this big like pile of walnuts in the middle of their kitchen table. And then, so when they started looking at the walnuts, they cracked one open and found the one-time pad. So if you had like a particularly sensitive set of keys that you needed to keep a hold of that that you maybe didn't want to write by hand on a piece of paper, or printing it out in a super small way just didn't make sense, microdots might be a good solution for you. So there are a few modern uses for this technology that you could easily get like a new sense of application out of. There's also this concept of a digital microdot, which is something that I'm kind of still playing around with. So with the sorry about that, with the advent of ultra high resolution imagery, you may have seen it where you can take a photo of a cityscape and zoom in from miles away on like the type of, like you could read a message on somebody's coffee mug. That type of digital technology could easily be used and reapplied to create something that is akin to a digital microdot. By hiding information in an ultra high resolution image and just giving somebody who needs that information the exact mapping on the image where they need to look, you could encode information and hide it in a digital image. Whether this is practical or not, again, just kind of boils down to your operational conditions. It doesn't, you would be applying a digital technology for essentially very little bandwidth in transferring of data. And that would also be fairly labor intensive as well. I did have a slide, but I guess I must have passed over it. One thing that you're going to need to take a note of, kind of ways to improve for next time, is for my situation with the microdot, I would have certainly used a microfiche or a much more high contrast film stock. That probably would have given me a true microdot and something that's readable under magnification. So there were a number of suggestions made to me in the Twitter thread where I kind of like laid all of this out. A lot of those film stocks are actually still available and relatively cheap. So if this is something that you want to reproduce, get to me after and I can try and dig up that information. But that would definitely be something I would improve for next time. You could also improve the focal length of your camera by getting a lens that would allow you to focus in on something that's much smaller. There's a lot of different things that you could do to improve this process. As somebody who's never made microdots before, I learned a lot from this. I learned a lot about the applications of technology that you could, or the applications to modern problems that you could put this toward. So this was, for me, this is just a very fun kind of hackery experiment. Speaks very much to the ethos of just kind of doing something because you can and learning a lot from it. So if you're interested and you have some of these materials just kind of laying around the house, there's really no good reason not to try it and see how you do with it. And now that you have the information on how to do it, then go forth and give it a try. So I want to, before I go to questions, I do want to throw a special thanks out there to two people who helped me out here. So Donna Mendez and Dr. Vince Houghton gave me a lot of information. When I was doing the research for this, really all I had to start with, because the techniques are not well known in public spheres, all I had to start with was a snippet from a book that came from a forum thread that pointed me to the kids' book on how to create microdots. And even that was not very thorough. So a lot of this I had to kind of piece together through just trial and error and my best reckoning for how to do it properly. So there's that, again, is just kind of like another thing that speaks to the ethos of just throw stuff at the wall and you may learn something that is not common knowledge, and maybe you can hand it out to other people who are interested. So that's my entire presentation. I believe I have like 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has anything, I'm open for questions now.
Great. Thanks very much, Emily. That was awesome. We got a lot of good questions and even some dad jokes in the chat going on when you're talking. So let's make through. There's a lot of really good questions that people got here. Let's see. So first one from Dave Mattingly. He was wondering, in spy history, were microdots generally in very tiny clear text, or were they also encoded? I'm sorry. Did you hear me in there?
Oh, I don't think I could hear you. Sorry.
Oh, I apologize. Let me get this going back here.
It might have been me. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so sorry, first question was from Dave Mattingly. He's wondering, in spy history, were microdots generally in very tiny clear text, or were they also encoded?
So you could see them in both. Generally, they were encoded though. So if they were used in wartime, they would probably encode them. Yeah, most of the examples I've seen have been encoded text committed to Microdot. Just as an added layer of security. So the entire process here is a process of security through obscurity, ultimately, which we tend to look down on in modern digital security. But you can't undercut the fact that there may just be an application where obscurity is going to help you out quite a bit. In the event that I lose this, you're not going to find these things. I mean, like I only found it because I knew that I dropped it in the general vicinity. Like Jeff saw me drop this thing, and I was like, I instantly did not know where it went. So if you're making microdots, the perishability of the data is like almost instantaneous. It would get vacuumed up in my house easily. So encoding it is just kind of an added bonus to putting it on a microdot.
Okay, great, thanks. And so Susie asks if this was similar, or is there maybe some overlaps to microfiche of years ago?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. The two technologies are basically the same thing. So whereas microfiche is meant to take an entire archive and make it small enough for storage, the original intent, as I kind of went over in the early slides, was to make it easier for a homing pigeon to carry it. But yeah, another kind of modern instantiation of this is to take entire libraries and shrink down the information into something that's just easier to store. So it's essentially the same technology. You're using the same film stock if you really want to get one that's in good condition, readable. So yeah, there's definitely overlap there.
I guess you went to reset everything.
Let's see. Mark asks, or maybe more of a comment you can elaborate on. So there doesn't seem like there's any equipment needed here that seems particularly incriminating. Maybe that's by design.
Yeah, there's really not. There's nothing incriminating about the technology that I used here, and in part that could be by design. I believe the British method was probably created for that specific purpose. But yeah, I mean, you could go through the trouble of buying a very old Minox camera. I don't know that anybody really produces these things anymore. So if you wanted one, it would probably be an antique in the first place. But yeah, you're not using any specialized equipment here. I was actually, one of the things I was super shocked by when I started doing this project was that I didn't need to. The most specialized piece of equipment that I bought, that because I didn't have it, was an X-Acto knife. But everything else is just, you would probably have it around the house. You could do this easily.
Yeah. Maybe a follow-up question from Dave. Since most modern cameras have autofocus, he's wondering if older cameras work best?
I would imagine that probably older cameras do work best. You're going to need to have the manual focus because a lot of times these documents are going to be just small enough that you're not going to be able to focus in on them with autofocus. Yeah. It's a good notation. Not a problem I ran into because my single lens reflex camera is manual by default. So I would have to switch on autofocus in order to get that feature.
Okay, great. Another question. Is the information content of a microdot more limited by the resolution of the film or the maximum distance between the camera and the object?
So I would say that it's more the resolution of the film, because the smaller that you're getting it, the more contrast you're going to have between the characters and the just the kind of natural background of the film stock. So in my case, what I experienced was a much more pronounced difference in or a much higher limitation, I should say, in film stock than I did just the distance between my lens and the image. Now, I would say that if I wanted to do like a one step or a one stage film product that got me a microdot, that would probably be easier than doing the focus on the 2-stage, because focusing in on the like 35 millimeter negative is not to be understated how difficult that is. It's a guessing game. There's just really no way of knowing whether you're in focus or not, at least in the way that I did it. So it turns out that I think it probably was relatively in focus when I took the photo, but the lacking quality of the film stock just didn't make it readable. But you can tell what it was for sure if you knew what you started with. So I'll consider that a victory.
Yeah, absolutely. That's impressive. See a follow-up here from Dave. If I remember right, aren't negatives usually mirror imaged? So would a microdot usually come out reversed unless some sort of steps were taken?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one that I thought of. That was actually, I had a conversation with Jana Mendez on the phone. Jana used to work for the agency, and she was chief of disguise for many years. One of the things that I asked her before I started the 2-step or the 2-stage was like, is this going to be reversed? Do I need to worry about that? And she's like, I don't know. So I ended up having to kind of figure that one out on my own. But I think the reality of the situation is that the negative itself is visible from both sides. So whether it's reversed or not doesn't actually impact the end state product with this technique, or at least I didn't experience it in a way that really I ran into any problems. Now, again, it wasn't terribly readable on the Microdot version, so I can't say that with 100% certainty. But I don't believe I had any reversing. I think it was as it should be when it came out ultimately. So good question, though. Something I had to deal with.
Yeah, a little mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So another one here. Could you put a microdot on a projector slide and shine it on the wall to make it readable? Does that work?
So in film, in my high school days, I was a film student. I was a photography student, and we had special rigs in order to take a 35 millimeter film stock and put it onto like a piece of negative paper. And the way that you would do that is with a thing called an enlarger. And so you'd put the negative mount it inside the enlarger, and it's basically like an overhead projector that just shines light through and projects the image larger on like a mat at the bottom. So yes, the answer is yes. You can technically do this if you have a large enough apparatus to do that. I believe that's definitely specialized equipment. That's not even something that I think you'd find in a standard darkroom at a college, university, or anything. So you can do it, but you're gonna have to find some very specialized analog technology to help you do that for sure.
Okay, great. Tracy is asking, how many microdots did you lose in this process?
I didn't lose any. I mean, I lost them and refound them. So if you want to count the times that I lost them, 5 in the last 12 hours, 5 times in total. I think it was the same tricky microdot that I have, and I have like 2 of them. So I lost one and refound it 5 times in the last 12 hours. But the last 12 hours is the only time I actually had any loss of them. So previous to this, I was doing it with the lick the finger and dab it method of microdot wrangling. So it worked. It's fairly successful.
Great. A couple people were asking, what do you think about the idea of a QR code on a microdot?
Yeah. That was another kind of digital hybrid that I was thinking of. So you could increase your bandwidth for transfer by putting a QR code onto microdot and having it be readable for somebody maybe who you wanted to get them information, but you wanted to give them an added level of security or find a way to transfer something, more information to them. You could hypothetically do this. I think it would be relatively labor intensive to do that though, because then standard technology is not going to be able to take a picture of a QR code that's in a microdot. So You could potentially, one thing I could try if I wanted to continue with this experiment is to get one of those lenses that you can attach to an iPhone that will let you take like micro photography. That may be something that you could do in order to try to get a good shot of it. I don't know whether that would work. In theory, it would work, but actually getting the QR code to be readable itself would be challenging, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Then the last question I think is just the basic, like, what made you want to do this? Where did you get the idea?
So this was when I started writing this zine called The Teletypist about a year ago, and The Teletypist is just kind of the output of all of my work for doing it's a project that I call the Hacking History Project. So I work with a couple other people on this, and the entire intent here is to put in Freedom of Information Act requests to the government and have them give us information back on old hacks and old hackers. I've been fairly successful with this. And so my goal here was to every year publish a new version of this zine with kind of updates on the last year's progress. And there's kind of an underlying narrative structure to it. But what I wanted to do when I first started this project was to put something that I called added value into every issue. So in the first issue, I had an RFID sticker that if you got one of the physical copies, you would be able to dump the information from the sticker in raw form, and you would be able to pull the hex out of it and then translate the hex. I think maybe one person did this, but it's for my own entertainment. So the reason I started doing this was to have some added value for the second issue. So if you're interested in having a microdot, look out for issue 2 of The Teletypist, because there may be some added value here in this pill case when I get around to actually publishing it. So that's why I did it, for fun and for not profit.
Okay, great. And then we'll probably leave maybe with just a couple of dad jokes I think we collected during. There were a lot, but I collected a couple of them.
I'm pleased by this.
There was a question about would a micro Pac-Man eat micro dots, was the first one. And then the second one, maybe the better one, was would aquarium news articles be stored on microfiche?
I'm groaning on the inside.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's yeah. we need a whole track or a whole channel just for the various dad jokes to come out there. Thank you very much for doing this. This is really interesting, really informative, and just a nice deep dive into all the technology behind this.
Great. Thanks everyone for coming.
Feel free to connect with people through your Twitter handle and all that kind of stuff into the chat. So if people have got that, feel free to stick around. And thanks again for the great talk. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
See ya.